Hello again, and welcome to the PowerPoint presentation for Unit 13, Week 13, Journalism 301 Online History of the Mass Media. We are getting very close to the end of the semester, and your Project 2 and final exam will be coming up, and I hope you'll let me know if you're having any problems or if you have any questions. If I can possibly help you, I will be happy to do so. I want to step back a little bit and go over a few things that you've probably read about a little bit of this, but I want to emphasize how important it is. I don't know if you've ever wondered why print journalism, newspapers, magazines, books, things of that nature, are not regulated by the government. They're protected. They're a totally protected industry. In fact, they're the only protected industry in the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law that interferes with the freedom of the press. So they have almost total freedom to publish. Of course, if they do something illegal, they will have to face the consequences, but no one is regulating them. And in the case of broadcasting, radio, and television, some of that, a substantial portion of that, is regulated by the government, and here's why. Two main reasons for the difference. In times of war or in times of great danger or emergency, the government could actually use broadcasting as a means of an instantaneous communication to get the word out to the military or to get the word out to the public. And so that makes it an especially powerful tool for the government, and the government wanted to regulate that. But also, unlike a printing press, the airwaves, which used to be the only way to get radio and television signals out, there weren't an unlimited supply of those. A printing press can print as much as it can afford to be printed by use of ink and paper, but there are not an unlimited supply of the airwaves. So this became known as the legal concept, scarcity of the spectrum, because there isn't a lot of an unlimited supply of airwaves in the electromagnetic spectrum. This had to be regulated so that it could be used for the public good. So if broadcast needed to be regulated, of course it had to be regulated by the federal government. In 1910, Congress passed a law that radio stations had to be licensed by the Department of Commerce. And so radio stations started getting licenses mainly for ships and boats. But the Wireless Ship Act of 1912 actually required ships that had radios to keep them on. And if you'll think about your history, we've just had the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. That was in 1912. And you know from if you've watched the movie, if the closest ship to the Titanic had had its radio on, it could have gone there and saved a lot more lives. But it had its radio off, and it was allowed to do that under federal law at the time. The Wireless Ship Act changed all of that. If you had a radio set on a ship, you had to keep it on. But nobody was really regulating anything. The Department of Commerce just kind of issuing licenses willy-nilly. So the Zenith Radio Corporation sued the Department of Commerce and won, and something had to be done about those radio licenses. So the result was the Communication Act of 1927. It established some important things about broadcasting. One of them, the radio waves belong to the people, and that includes the television waves. Anything that's up above us in the electromagnetic spectrum cannot be owned by anybody or by a corporation. It belongs to us. It has to be distributed equally, and the government has the right to regulatory powers. The Act also contained a clause that would govern American broadcasting forevermore. It said broadcasters must act in the public interest, convenience, and necessity, and this means they had to act for the public good and not for any other reason, and that meant regulatory powers over broadcasting were going to be pretty broad. A new government agency came out of this, the Federal Radio Commission, and the very first thing it did was to revoke all of those licenses that had been issued by the Department of Commerce, and it required the owners of those licenses to reapply for them. It made them stay on a certain radio frequency. Before that, the radio frequencies were all over the place, and you didn't know who you were tuning into on any given night or day. So they made them keep them all on the same channel, if you want to look at it that way. And the commission had the right to investigate to see if they were staying on the right channels and if they were acting in the public interest. Television was coming. Radio was not going to be able to completely cover all of the laws that were going to be needed for television. So President Roosevelt asked for a new law, and the result was the Communications Act of 1934. It gave the Commission even broader powers, not only over broadcasting, but also telephones, telegraph, and undersea cables. Anything that could be communicated point to point or point to broadcast, anything like that came under the power of the Federal Communications Commission. Of special interest to Mississippi, radio was a real boon because Mississippi was and still is a state that depends a lot on agriculture, and for the first time rural residents were able to connect with the outside world. In real time, they could know what was happening absolutely at that moment. And farm reporting was important for farmers and also for homemakers throughout Mississippi, depended on radio to bring them the latest information. The National Farm and Home Hour was extremely popular on NBC. It originated in Chicago and went nationwide to all of the farmers across the nation. And on the southern front, WSB in Atlanta had a very popular home show, Dixie Farm and Home Hour. It became common for stations to request their own call letters. I think these are kind of interesting. WLS in Chicago stands for World's Largest Store, and that was the Sears store in Chicago. WSB in Atlanta, Welcome South Brother. WJTV in Jackson absolutely stands for Jackson TV. WDSU in New Orleans stood for the DeSoto Hotel, which was where the radio station was located. And I find this one interesting. In rural New York, there was a WDFH that stood for Dobbs Ferry High School. A few from my past, I have worked at all of these stations. WLOX in Biloxi, the middle letters, of course, LOX, you can see where those came from. In Charlotte, North Carolina, WSOC, We Serve Our City. WTVC in Chattanooga, television, Chattanooga. And I also worked for, in Charleston, South Carolina, WCBD, which stood for Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester counties. We had a joke among ourselves that we called it We Couldn't Be Dumber. It was just a joke that we had. We never told anyone on the outside. But that's just something we made up and laughed to ourselves about. So the FCC began issuing call letters. They were going to run out of call letters, and they wanted them to be somewhat uniform. So they started making the W's, the ones that began with W's, to the east of the Mississippi, and the K's to the west of the Mississippi. But if they had already issued the call letters, they left them alone, like KDKA in Pittsburgh, which has the distinction of being the first radio broadcasting station on the air in the United States. It began broadcasting in November of 1920. World War II delayed television. The FCC gave out television licenses, but it had to stop it, and it started up again in 1948. The model for giving out these licenses was already in place, but they still had to tweak it a little bit. And the years 1948 to 1942 are known as the golden age of television. Very little competition because there were very few television stations on the air. In the early days, news wasn't seen as important. Newscasts were usually just a guy sitting in front of a television camera and reading the news for about 15 minutes. It was pretty boring. There were a couple of shows, though, that dealt with the news in a little bit longer format, like Meet the Press, which is still on the air. CBS's See It Now, which was an Edward R. Murrow program. Those dealt with the news in a little bit more detail. But really it was the improvements in graphics and film and news personalities that helped TV news become profitable. And now it's extremely profitable. That's why we see so much of it on television. TV's powerful moments, Murrow versus McCarthy. You have seen that in Good Night and Good Luck, which is a pretty accurate representation of what happened. The civil rights movement showed the power of television because for the first time it brought into people's homes the graphic representation of what African Americans were really going through, particularly in the South. And before that, people had only heard about discrimination. And if you were living out in a rural area, you might not even come into contact with what this discrimination was really like. When it was brought on television into your home, it began to change minds. And this was extremely important. It changed minds so much that federal laws were passed to prohibit discrimination. So very, very important in the civil rights movement. Now, the Daisy spot was another moment that showed the power of television. It was a commercial for President Lyndon Johnson. He was running for his first full term. You may remember from your history that he took over the presidency when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. President Johnson became the president, but this was his first time to run for a full term in 1964. He was running against a Republican by the name of Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona. Barry Goldwater wanted the United States to be very tough with the Russians, the Soviet Union at that time. And he talked a lot about we needed to be tough. And President Johnson and his campaign came up with the Daisy spot. It didn't really say that Barry Goldwater was dangerous. It didn't say that at all. It just, through graphic representation that only television could do, it presented a disturbing image of what might happen if Barry Goldwater was elected and not President Johnson. So I want you to take a look at it in this unit and kind of compare it to the campaign spots that you've seen within the last month or two. And just see if you can see any correlation between that spot and what we have now. The Daisy spot only aired one time the night before the election in 1964, but it was extremely powerful, and it is still talked about today as being television's most powerful moment, or one of its most powerful moments. Increasingly, print and broadcast began to do investigative reporting, not just reporting things that people told them, but they began looking at things very, very closely. And this is what you saw in All the President's Men. Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, they were just police beat reporters, but they got a hold of a story and they wouldn't let it go. They zeroed in. They worked tirelessly and relentlessly, and it was just 5 burglars trying to break into the Democratic headquarters in Washington. And the story ended with the resignation of a U.S. president, and that just demonstrated how investigative journalism could be powerful. Now, we don't have so much investigative journalism anymore, but when we do see an investigation, it really does change our minds about things very often and change the way government looks at issues and changes our laws.